Rome wasn't built in a day, but if it had been, perhaps it could have avoided all the bloodshed that went on during its construction. From conquering other civilizations to disposing of political enemies, Rome did it with blood. The greatest city in the ancient world was also one of the most brutal, and no form of violence was too extreme for them, not even sacrificing their own people to appease the gods. But what was the worst execution method used by the Romans? What was the most terrifying way that they killed their prisoners? Well, there was one way of executing people that scared even the most seasoned Romans, damnatio, ad bestias. This means condemnation to the beasts. It was the Roman practice of feeding condemned criminals or slaves to wild animals. This might have been done in a public arena or in private, but the victims always met the same gruesome end. If you wanted to be condemned to the beasts, you were lucky to have a quick death. Usually, however, your demise was agonizing, humiliating, and slow. So let us take a look at Damnatio ad Bestias and how this horrifying Roman tradition still influences our culture today. Welcome to my channel. Today we will explore Damnatio ad Bestias, Rome's most savage execution. Let us know in the comments if you can think of a more barbaric punishment. If you've seen the movie Gladiator, then you've probably seen a version of Damnatio ad Bestias. Maximus and his band of rebels fight their way through Rome's armies, eventually facing off against the emperor himself. In the film, Russell Crowe's character is falsely convicted of mutiny and sentenced to death. He is then thrown into the center of the Colosseum, where he must fight to survive against lions sent to kill him. This scene is just one small part of the history of Damnatio ad Bestias. In ancient Rome, people would be condemned to the beasts as punishment for a variety of crimes. Oftentimes, those who opposed the ruling government or committed treason would be put to death in such a manner. For example, Catiline, a Roman senator, plotted to overthrow the government in 63 BC. When his plan was discovered, he was put to death by the Roman Senate. Sources differ as to how exactly he was executed, but it's clear that he was condemned to the beasts. Some accounts claim that he took his own life to avoid capture, while others say that he was thrown into the Tiber River while being pursued by wild animals. Cassius Dio's Roman history provides another account of Catiline's death. According to this version, Catiline fled to Greece after learning of his plan's failure. However, while traveling, he was captured by Publius Ceriliu Vaso, a Roman senator. Cassius Dio wrote that Publius threw Catiline into a bronze statue of a chariot like a wild animal and whipped him until he died. Then he threw his body into a pit full of hungry lions. There are many tales of Romans being condemned to the beasts, some true and others likely exaggerated for dramatic effect. But the basic story is always the same, whether the condemned person is thrown to the lions or the lions are thrown to them. There are two winners, the crowd watching and the lions. In fact, Damnatio ad Bestias was one of the most popular forms of entertainment in ancient Rome. People would come from all over the empire to watch these spectacles. Of course, this meant that those being thrown to the beasts had to be put on display. They were paraded through the streets of Rome before being thrown into the Colosseum or some other public space. This was done so that everyone could see them and know that the condemned was meeting his or her fate because of their crime. It was a warning to others who might consider opposing the government. But why use wild animals? Why not just kill the condemned with swords or spears? Well, for the Romans, killing someone with a sword or spear was too easy, too quick. It didn't give the crowds enough time to enjoy the spectacle. Plus, it was boring. After all, the whole point of having an execution was to make an example out of the criminal. To really do that, the death had to be slow and painful. What better way to ensure that than throwing them to a pride of lions? Not only did this ensure that the condemned would die slowly, but it also gave the crowds plenty of opportunities to cheer and place bets. Which lion would kill the victim first? Would the victim be torn limb from limb, or would they be eaten alive? These were the kinds of questions that kept the crowds coming back for more, and the Romans weren't afraid to use any kind of animal, whether it was a snake, a scorpion, or a crocodile. No creature was too small or too insignificant to be used in damnatio ad bestias. Sometimes people were even thrown to horses, chariots, or even cars. The condemned might have also been forced to fight each other while wild animals watched on. Imagine being trapped in the middle of two hungry lions while trying to fight another person. You'd be torn apart in seconds. There were even instances when the condemned were sewn up in leather sacks along with snakes, monkeys, or other animals, and then thrown into the audience at the gladiator games. These unlucky spectators would then be ripped open and devoured by the beasts inside. No one was safe at the Roman games unless, of course, you were a lion. Even though damnatio ad bestias was supposed to be a punishment, in reality, it was much more than that. It was a form of entertainment, a warning, and a way to keep the population under control. By showing people what would happen if they disobeyed the government, the Romans made sure that no one would ever forget who was in charge. As you can imagine, the logistics of damnatio ad bestias required a lot of planning. The authorities had to make sure that there were enough wild animals to go around. To that end, they created special facilities where animals could be kept and trained. One of the most famous of these was the Venetians, a group of men who were responsible for capturing wild animals and training them for use in the games. The men who carried out damnatio ad bestias were known as bestiarii. These men were slaves or criminals who had been sentenced to death. So rather than being thrown to the beasts themselves, they were tasked with carrying out the will of the emperor. Sometimes the bestiaries would have to fight the condemned person before throwing the wild animals into the mix. These fights were usually brutal and bloody, but they were also very popular with the crowds. For the condemned, of course, there was no such thing as a fair fight. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and often unarmed. The bestiaries would beat them with clubs or swords until they were exhausted and helpless. Only then would the bestiaries throw the wild animals into the mix. The sight of a person being torn apart by a pride of lions or a pack of wolves never got old for the Romans. It was a reminder of the power of the wild and the fragility of human life. We may shudder at the thought of damnatio ad bestias today, but it was once a common form of punishment. It's important to remember that the Romans weren't monsters. They were just people who lived in a different time and had different customs. However, we should still remember the victims of damnatio ad bestias. These were real people who suffered a horrible death. We owe it to them to remember their sacrifice and honor their memory. The history of damnatio ad bestias is a dark one, but it's also an important one. It's a reminder of the cruelty that humans are capable of, but also the strength of the human spirit. Those who were condemned to the beasts were some of the luckiest people in Rome. At least they got a quick death. Many others died slowly and painfully, but they never gave up hope. They fought back against their attackers, sometimes even killing one or two before they themselves were killed. There are many stories of bravery from this dark period in history. One of the most famous comes from the Roman Emperor Trajan. He was known for his military victories and his cruelty. But one day he unleashed his fury on the wrong person. He ordered a Roman senator named Pliny the Younger to be thrown to the lions. But Pliny didn't go down without a fight. He managed to kill several lions before he was finally torn apart. His bravery was rewarded when Trajan had him executed in a more humane way. Another famous victim of Damnatio at Bestias was the philosopher Epictetus. He was a former slave who became one of Rome's leading philosophers, but he fell out of favor with the Emperor Hadrian and was thrown to the lions. Again, he didn't go down without a fight. He taunted the lions and encouraged them to attack him. Finally, one of the lions bit off his hand. But Epictetus continued to taunt him until he was torn apart. These are just two examples of the many people who were condemned to the beasts in ancient Rome. They were brave and strong, and they never gave up hope, even in the face of death. Today, we remember the victims of Damnatio at Bestias as heroes. They remind us that no matter how difficult the situation may seem, we should never give up hope. Even in the darkest of times, there is always light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you for watching. Please share your thoughts on this brutal Roman tradition in the comments below. See you next time.